Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable resilience and, let's say, creative discomfort tolerance of the Viking people, who somehow managed to survive Scandinavian winters without central heating. Picture this. You're huddled in a smoky wooden hall with your entire extended family, 3 goats, a pig, and that one cousin who snores like a wounded walrus. Outside, the wind is howling at minus 30 degrees Celsius, and inside, well, inside isn't exactly what you'd call toasty either. The truth is, if you were dropped into a Viking winter with nothing but your modern sensibilities and a Netflix subscription, you probably wouldn't make it past the first blizzard. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When the temperature outside dropped to what scientists would politely call absolutely not, the Vikings didn't panic. They simply retreated into their longhouses, massive, low-slung structures that were part home, part barn, and part medieval experiment in human-animal cohabitation. These weren't exactly the cozy cottages you see in fairy tales. Think more like aircraft hangars made of timber and turf, designed by people who believed that privacy was a luxury and central heating was for weaklings. You enter through a heavy wooden door that probably weighs more than your car, and immediately you're hit by a wall of, let's call it, atmosphere. The air is thick with smoke from the central hearth, the earthy smell of hay and animal fur, and the unmistakable aroma of too many people living in too small a space for too long. Your eyes water instantly, not from emotion, but from the chronic smoke exposure that every Viking just accepted as part of life. The longhouse stretches out before you like a dimly lit tunnel of survival. The central corridor runs down the middle, flanked by raised sleeping platforms where entire families arrange themselves like human sardines. But here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting, I mean deeply uncomfortable by modern standards. Those sleeping areas, they're not just for people. The Vikings had discovered that the most efficient heating system available was what historians politely call shared body warmth, and what we might call strategic cuddling with livestock. You see, when the outside world becomes a frozen wasteland that could kill you in minutes, suddenly sharing your bed with a sheep doesn't seem so unreasonable. These animals were living, breathing space heaters that happened to also provide milk, meat, and wool. Historians still argue whether this arrangement was born out of pure necessity, or if the Vikings actually preferred their 4-legged roommates to some of their human relatives. And honestly, after spending a few months in close quarters, you might start to see their point. The hearth dominates the center of everything. A long, stone-lined fire pit that runs like a glowing spine through the heart of the building. This isn't just where you cook your food. It's the beating heart of Viking winter survival. The fire never goes out, ever. Because letting that flame die during a Scandinavian winter is essentially signing your own death warrant. Someone is always on fire duty, feeding it logs, adjusting the airflow, and making sure those precious embers stay alive through the long, dark months. But here's the thing about Viking heating systems. They didn't exactly come with user manuals or safety inspections. The smoke from that central fire has to go somewhere, and unfortunately, somewhere often meant everywhere inside the house. There are no proper chimneys here, just holes in the roof that may or may not be aligned with wind patterns. So you're breathing what is essentially barbecue smoke, mixed with the exhalations of multiple families and their pets, 24 hours a day, for months on end. Your modern lungs would probably stage a revolt after about 10 minutes, but the Vikings just carried on with their daily routines, their eyes permanently watery and their voices probably deeper than nature intended. Some scholars suggest this constant smoke exposure actually helped preserve food hanging from the rafters, which is great for medieval meal planning but terrible for anyone hoping to see their 40th birthday without chronic respiratory issues. The walls themselves are works of desperate engineering, thick timber frames stuffed with whatever insulating material could be found. moss, straw, animal hair, mud, and sometimes just more wood. The idea was to create as many barriers as possible between the inside warmth and the outside death trap, even if those barriers happened to be somewhat aromatic after a few months of use. This is where you'll spend the next several months of your life, assuming you survive the experience. Welcome to Viking winter accommodations, where comfort is optional, but survival is mandatory. The first rule of Viking winter fashion was simple. If you're not wearing at least 3 layers, you're probably going to become a very well-dressed ice sculpture. You wake up on your straw-stuffed sleeping platform, and the first challenge of the day isn't finding coffee. It's finding the motivation to leave the warm cocoon of wool blankets and fur pelts that have kept you alive through another night. Your Viking wardrobe starts with linen, if you're fortunate enough to own any. This base layer sits against your skin like a whisper of civilization in a world gone cold. Linen wicks away moisture and provides that crucial barrier between your body and the rougher wool that's coming next. But here's the catch. Linen is expensive, fragile, and about as common as a Viking who complains quietly. Most people skip straight to wool, which means your skin gets acquainted very quickly with the scratchy reality of sheep fiber. You pull on your wool tunic and immediately understand why Vikings were known for their stoic expressions. This isn't the soft, processed wool you might buy today. This is wool that still remembers being on a sheep, complete with natural oils and a texture that could probably sand down rough timber. But it works. Oh, does it work? Wool retains heat even when wet, which is crucial when you're living in a climate that specializes in cold dampness. Over the tunic go wool trousers, then leg wraps, essentially medieval thermal leggings made from long strips of wool cloth wound around your calves like bandages. These aren't just fashion statements, they're survival gear disguised as clothing. The wrapping technique creates multiple air pockets that trap warm air close to your skin. Historians still argue whether Vikings learned this technique from other cultures or developed it independently. But honestly, when you're facing 6 months of sub-zero temperatures, innovation happens quickly. Your feet get special attention because frostbite doesn't negotiate. Viking boots were masterpieces of practical engineering. Animal hide, usually from cattle or seals, shaped and stitched into waterproof fortresses for your toes. The secret ingredient? Fat. Lots and lots of animal fat, rubbed into the leather until it becomes essentially waterproof. Yes, this means your feet smell like a medieval delicatessen, but it also means you keep all 10 toes through the winter. For the truly desperate, or perhaps the truly innovative, some Vikings experimented with intestine raincoats. Picture this. You take the cleaned, scraped intestines of large animals, stitch them together, and create a waterproof outer layer that keeps out wind and snow. It's not breathable, it's definitely not attractive, and you probably don't want to think too hard about what you're wearing. But when the alternative is freezing to death, suddenly wearing processed animal guts becomes a reasonable fashion choice. The cloak is your crown jewel. A massive wool rectangle that fastens at the shoulder with a brooch and becomes your portable shelter. This isn't just outerwear. It's a blanket, a windbreak, a privacy screen, and in extreme emergencies, a shared warming system for multiple people. The wealthy lined their cloaks with fur, bear, wolf, or seal, creating garments that were essentially wearable sleeping bags. Your hands present a special challenge because Viking life requires manual dexterity. You need to handle tools, weapons, cooking implements, and livestock, but you also need to prevent your fingers from snapping off like icicles. Mittens were the compromise solution, thick wool coverings that sacrifice individual finger movement for collective warmth. When you needed fine motor control, you'd quickly slip your hands out, accomplish the task, and shove them back into the wool cocoons before numbness set in. Hats were non-negotiable. Heat escapes through your head faster than gossip spreads through a small village, so every Viking wore some form of head covering. Wool caps, fur hats, or simple cloth wraps, anything to keep your skull from becoming a heat radiator. Some archaeologists have found evidence of ear flaps and neck guards, suggesting that Vikings understood the importance of protecting every exposed bit of skin. The truly paranoid, or perhaps the truly experienced, wore multiple hats. a thin wool cap under a thicker fur hat, creating an insulation system that could handle even the most vicious wind. Yes, this meant walking around looking like your head had been inflated, but vanity tends to take a back seat when survival is at stake. Here's something that might surprise you. Vikings were obsessive about personal hygiene, even in winter. They combed their hair daily, trimmed their beards, and even used primitive tweezers to remove unwanted facial hair. This wasn't vanity, it was practical. Clean hair and skin insulate better than dirty hair and skin. Plus, when you're living in close quarters with extended family and livestock, personal grooming becomes a community service. The final touch to your Viking winter ensemble was attitude. You wore these clothes like armor because, in many ways, that's exactly what they were. Every layer was a barrier between you and death, every wool fiber a small victory against the cold. When you stepped outside wearing your complete Viking winter outfit, you weren't just dressed, you were equipped for battle against the elements. When it comes to surviving frigid Scandinavian nights, the Vikings had one culinary philosophy: eat like your life depends on it, because it literally does. You stumble toward the central hearth as the first gray light of dawn filters through the smoke hole, and your stomach reminds you that calories aren't just food. They're fuel for your internal furnace. In a world where your body is working overtime just to keep your blood from freezing, every meal becomes a strategic refueling operation. The centerpiece of Viking winter cuisine was the perpetual stew, a massive iron cauldron that hung over the fire like a bubbling shrine to survival. This wasn't fine dining, this was practical nutrition elevated to an art form. You peer into the pot and see a thick brown mixture that contains whatever protein, vegetables, and grains the household could scrape together. Yesterday's leftover meat mingles with today's root vegetables, while barley and oats thicken the mixture into something that sticks to your ribs and possibly to the bowl. The beauty of perpetual stew was its flexibility and efficiency. New ingredients got added as they became available, and the pot never completely emptied. Some scholars suggest that certain Viking stews might have been cooking continuously for weeks, with layers of flavor building like geological strata. Historians still argue whether this cooking method was born from laziness or genius. But when you're burning thousands of calories just staying warm, a constantly available hot meal starts looking like pure brilliance. Preserved fish dominated the protein landscape with an intensity that would make modern nutritionists weep. The Vikings had elevated fish preservation to levels that bordered on the obsessive. Cod, herring, and salmon were smoked, salted, dried, fermented, and sometimes all four, creating protein sources that could survive months of storage without refrigeration. Lutefisk, white fish soaked in lye until it achieved a texture somewhere between jelly and rubber, represented the extreme end of Viking food preservation technology. Your breakfast might include a chunk of this preserved fish torn apart with your fingers and chewed slowly while your taste buds adjust to flavors that are, let's call them, assertive. The fish has been transformed by salt and smoke into something that barely resembles its original form, but it provides the protein and fats your body craves during the cold months. Modern palates might find it challenging, but your Viking digestive system has learned to appreciate nutrition over presentation. Dairy products provided crucial calories and nutrients through the dark months. Cheese wheels, hard as hockey pucks and twice as salty, were stored in cool corners of the Longhouse like edible treasures. These weren't the creamy, aged cheeses you might enjoy today. Viking cheese was designed for survival, not sophistication. The aging process happened naturally in the cold air, creating dense, protein-rich blocks that could be shaved off with a knife and eaten like medieval energy bars. Skyr occupied a special place in Viking winter nutrition, a fermented dairy product that straddled the line between cheese and yogurt. Its sour, tangy flavor cut through the monotony of preserved foods while providing probiotics that help maintain digestive health during months of challenging nutrition. You scoop it from ceramic bowls with wooden spoons, and the acidic bite makes your mouth water, while providing essential nutrients that fresh vegetables couldn't supply. Grains formed the foundation of Viking winter carbohydrates, stored in sealed containers and rationed carefully through the cold months. Barley and rye were ground into coarse flour and baked into dense dark breads that could survive for weeks without spoiling. Sometimes, when grain supplies ran low, creative cooks would add ground tree bark to stretch the flour further. This wasn't gourmet cooking. This was survival baking that prioritized calories and shelf life over flavor and texture. The bread emerged from crude ovens built into the walls of the Longhouse. Heavy, dark loaves that required serious jaw muscles to consume. You tear off chunks with your teeth, working the dense mass until your saliva breaks down the starches into digestible sugars. It's not pleasant, but it's fuel, and fuel is what keeps your internal fires burning through the endless winter nights. Alcohol served multiple purposes beyond recreation. Ale and mead provided calories, warmth, and mild antiseptic properties that helped prevent illness during the vulnerable winter months. The brewing process also created beverages that were safer to drink than water that might have been contaminated by frozen waste or animal runoff. You sip warm ale from wooden cups, feeling the alcohol burn gently in your chest while providing both comfort and practical nutrition. Mead, made from fermented honey, represented the luxury end of Viking winter drinking. The sweet, potent beverage provided quick energy, while the alcohol content offered temporary relief from the constant cold. Some archaeologists have found evidence that Vikings added herbs and spices to their mead, creating medicinal drinks that combined nutrition with primitive health care. The evening meal brought the community together around the central fire, sharing food and warmth in equal measure. You sit on wooden benches, shoulders touching your neighbors, passing bowls and cups while the perpetual stew bubbles and the preserved fish gets distributed according to family hierarchy and need. When winter hit hard, and in Scandinavia it always did, Vikings turned to their most reliable source of heat, other mammals. You wake up to the sound of a cow lowing softly just a few feet from your sleeping platform, and for a moment, you're not sure if you're in a home or a barn. The answer, of course, is both. Bringing animals indoors wasn't considered odd or unsanitary by Viking standards. It was considered brilliant heating technology disguised as livestock management. The section of the Longhouse dedicated to animals was called the byre, essentially a medieval stable that shared ventilation, walls, and sometimes even floor space with human living quarters. A low stone or wooden wall separated you from your four-legged roommates, but this barrier was more psychological than practical. On the coldest nights, when the wind outside sounded like angry spirits trying to claw through the walls, that separation became even more flexible. You share your living space with cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens, each animal serving as a living furnace that generates heat simply by existing. A single cow produces roughly as much warmth as a small campfire. But unlike fire, cows don't require constant feeding of precious wood fuel. They eat hay and grain, breathe steadily, and radiate warmth that can mean the difference between waking up with all your extremities or discovering that your toes have achieved the consistency of ice cubes. The logistics of indoor livestock required careful planning and constant management. Animal waste didn't magically disappear just because you were sharing a roof. Vikings developed systems for managing manure that balanced sanitation with warmth retention. Fresh straw was laid down regularly, and the composting process actually generated additional heat, though it also generated aromatic byproducts that would challenge modern sensibilities. Children learned early that animals were partners in survival, not just sources of food and materials. You might find yourself sleeping next to a sheep on particularly cold nights, using its woolly body as a living hot water bottle. The sheep, for its part, seemed content with the arrangement, probably appreciating the shared warmth as much as you did. Historians still argue whether this intimate relationship between humans and livestock contributed to Viking emotional resilience, or simply made them very practical about personal space. Goats presented special challenges and opportunities in the indoor ecosystem. These intelligent, stubborn animals provided milk, meat, and warmth, but they also possessed the supernatural ability to escape from any enclosure and investigate every corner of the Longhouse. You might wake up to find a goat examining your personal belongings with the focused attention of a medieval customs inspector. Their climbing abilities meant that no shelf was too high, no storage area too secure. Pigs offered excellent heat generation and the promise of bacon, but they also brought their own unique personality traits to the shared living arrangement. Vikings quickly learned that pigs are surprisingly intelligent and social animals who form opinions about their human roommates. A pig who decided it didn't like you could make your winter significantly more challenging through strategic placement of waste and carefully timed grunting sessions during your attempts to sleep. Chickens roosted in the rafters above your head, providing eggs, eventual meat, and a constant soundtrack of clucking, scratching, and occasional panic when something startled the flock. You learned to sleep through the sounds of poultry life happening directly above your bed, though the occasional chicken dropping provided unwelcome reminders of your unconventional living arrangements. The warmth generated by this collection of animals rose naturally, following the basic laws of physics that Vikings understood intuitively, even if they couldn't explain the science behind it. Hot air rises, cold air sinks, and the body heat from multiple large mammals creates thermal currents that circulate throughout the Longhouse. Strategic placement of animals near human sleeping areas maximized heat transfer while minimizing the more challenging aspects of interspecies cohabitation. During the worst storms, when even the animals seemed subdued by the violence of the weather outside, the Longhouse became a fortress of shared warmth. You huddled together, humans and animals alike, creating a biological heating system that no amount of wood burning could match. The sound of steady breathing, both human and animal, created a rhythmic backdrop that somehow made the howling wind seem less threatening. Some Vikings developed genuine affection for their winter roommates, giving names to cows and sheep who shared their homes for months at a time. These relationships blurred the lines between livestock and pets, creating emotional bonds that made eventual slaughter more complicated but also more meaningful. The animal that kept you warm through January might become your protein source in March, a cycle that Vikings accepted as natural and necessary. The morning routine included checking on your animal partners, ensuring they had water that hadn't frozen overnight, and adjusting their bedding for maximum comfort and heat generation. You learned to read animal behavior as indicators of temperature and weather conditions. Restless livestock often meant storms approaching, while calm animals suggested stable conditions. Viking sleeping arrangements were less about comfort and more about thermal mass engineering. You approach your designated sleeping area as darkness settles over the Longhouse, and the reality of medieval bedtime becomes crystal clear. This isn't about getting a good night's rest. This is about surviving until morning without becoming a human popsicle. Privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist when survival depended on shared body heat and collective warmth management. The sleeping platforms lined the walls like wooden shelves designed for storing humans instead of household goods. These raised beds kept you off the cold ground while positioning you at the optimal height to capture rising warm air from the central hearth and the breathing livestock below. You climb onto your section of the platform, which is barely wider than your body, and stuffed with whatever soft materials could be gathered: straw, dried moss, sheep's wool, and if you were particularly fortunate, down feathers saved from butchered birds. Your bedding consists of layers upon layers of wool blankets and animal hides arranged in a system that would make a military quartermaster proud. The bottom layer provides insulation from the wooden platform, while successive layers trap warm air and block drafts that sneak through gaps in the walls. Bearskins were the ultimate luxury, thick, warm, and large enough to cover multiple people. Wolf pelts offered excellent insulation, but required careful cleaning to avoid the lingering scent of wild predator. You sleep fully clothed, because changing into nightwear in sub-zero temperatures is essentially an invitation to hypothermia. Your wool tunic, trousers, and even your boots stay on through the night. Some Vikings wrapped additional cloth around their heads and necks, creating human burritos designed for maximum heat retention. The goal wasn't comfort in any modern sense. It was maintaining core body temperature until sunrise. Family sleeping arrangements followed practical rather than sentimental logic. Children were placed between adults to benefit from maximum body heat, while elderly family members received prime positions near the center of the group, where warmth was most abundant. Couples didn't necessarily sleep together for romantic reasons. They slept together because two bodies generate more heat than one. Extended family members, visiting relatives, and even close friends might find themselves sharing sleeping space based purely on thermal efficiency calculations. The communal aspect of Viking bedtime meant that everyone knew everyone else's sleep habits and bodily functions. Snoring, talking in sleep, and various digestive noises became part of the nighttime soundscape that everyone learned to ignore. Uncle Bjorn's legendary snoring might have sounded like a wounded bear, but it also meant he was breathing and generating heat, making him a valuable sleeping partner despite the acoustic challenges. Bathroom breaks during the night required careful calculation and considerable courage. Leaving the warm cocoon of shared bedding meant exposing yourself to temperatures that could cause frostbite in minutes. Chamber pots were strategically placed within reach, though using them required negotiations with sleeping neighbors and careful maneuvering in tight spaces. Some Vikings simply waited until morning, rather than risk the heat loss and social disruption of nighttime bathroom expeditions. Historians still argue whether Vikings used heated stones as bed warmers, but archaeological evidence suggests that some households placed stones near the fire during the evening and then wrapped them in cloth to provide localized warmth during the night. These primitive hot water bottles could make the difference between a tolerable night and a miserable one, though they also presented burn risks for restless sleepers. The morning wake-up process was a community affair that happened gradually as the central fire was rebuilt and breakfast preparations began. You didn't spring out of bed when you woke up. You waited for your turn to leave the shared warmth, timing your exit to coincide with maximum activity around the fire. The first person awake had the coldest experience, but also the honor of restoring the flames that would warm everyone else. Dreams in a Viking longhouse were probably influenced by the smoke, the close quarters, and the constant awareness of survival challenges. Some scholars suggest that the communal sleeping arrangements actually strengthened family bonds and community connections, as people literally depended on each other for warmth and comfort throughout the long winter nights. Children learned early that bedtime wasn't about individual preferences or personal space. It was about contributing to the collective thermal management system. Young Vikings understood that their body heat helped keep grandparents warm, while adult family members provided the security and warmth that kept children alive through the harsh northern winters. The end of winter brought relief not just from cold temperatures, but also from the intense intimacy of shared sleeping spaces. As weather warmed and animals could return to outdoor shelters, families could spread out and reclaim some personal space. But the bonds formed during those months of necessary closeness often lasted lifetimes, creating community connections forged by shared survival experiences that modern society rarely requires. The smoke in a Viking longhouse wasn't just an unfortunate byproduct of heating, it was a permanent resident with its own personality and agenda. You learn quickly that breathing in a medieval home means developing a relationship with smoke that ranges from grudging acceptance to active hostility, depending on wind direction and your luck with seating arrangements. The central hearth produces a steady stream of wood smoke that's supposed to rise up and escape through openings in the roof. But smoke, like cats and small children, rarely does what it's supposed to do. In theory, the smoke follows the path of least resistance, drifting upward through the rafters and eventually finding its way outside through carefully planned vents and holes. In practice, smoke behaves like a mischievous spirit that enjoys settling in the exact spot where you're trying to sleep, eat, or breathe. Cold air pushes down from above, while warm air rises from below, creating air currents that turn smoke distribution into an unpredictable daily lottery. Your eyes water constantly, not from emotion or allergies, but from the steady irritation of wood smoke that has nowhere else to go. After a few weeks of this exposure, your tear ducts work overtime, while your respiratory system adapts to breathing air that would probably violate several modern environmental regulations. The Vikings didn't have the luxury of complaining about air quality. They simply developed lungs that could process atmosphere that was part oxygen, part smoke, and part determination. The smoke did serve some practical purposes that helped justify the respiratory challenges. Food hanging from the rafters, strips of meat, fish, and vegetables, received constant smoking that preserved them for months without spoilage. Your winter protein supply slowly cured in the same air you breathed, creating a natural food preservation system that worked remarkably well despite the obvious health trade-offs. Insects and small pests avoided the smoky environment, which meant fewer problems with flies, moths, and other creatures that might contaminate food supplies or spread disease. The smoke created a natural pesticide barrier that protected stored grains and preserved foods from invasive species that could destroy winter nutrition supplies. Some archaeologists suggest that the constant smoke exposure also provided mild antiseptic benefits, though this came at the cost of chronic respiratory irritation. The ceiling and walls of the Longhouse developed a dark patina from months of smoke exposure, a black coating that covered every surface like medieval paint. This wasn't considered unsightly or problematic. It was simply the natural result of indoor fire management in a world without chimneys. The darkened wood actually absorbed and radiated heat more efficiently, creating thermal mass that helped stabilize indoor temperatures. Children and elderly family members suffered most from the smoke exposure, being closer to the ground where heavier smoke particles tended to settle. You'd see Viking youngsters with perpetually runny noses and watery eyes. They're developing respiratory systems adapting to air quality that would send modern parents into panic mode. Historians still argue whether this early smoke exposure strengthened immune systems or simply created a population with remarkable tolerance for respiratory challenges. Some longhouses featured primitive smoke management systems, strategically placed openings or wind deflectors that helped direct smoke flow away from primary living areas. The wealthy might afford better ventilation design, while poorer families simply endured whatever smoke patterns their basic shelters provided. Social status could literally be measured by the quality of air you breathed during winter months. Ventilation became a delicate balance between smoke management and heat retention. Opening doors or windows to clear the air also released precious warm air that took significant fuel to replace. Vikings learned to time ventilation periods carefully, choosing moments when wind conditions favored smoke removal without excessive heat loss. This required understanding local weather patterns and developing intuitive knowledge about air pressure and atmospheric conditions. The evening hours brought the worst smoke conditions as cooking fires, heating fires, and oil lamps combined to create atmospheric conditions that would challenge even experienced Vikings. You learned to position yourself strategically during meal preparation, finding spots where air currents carried smoke away from your immediate breathing space. Seating arrangements around the fire weren't just about social hierarchy, they were about respiratory survival. Visitors to Viking longhouses often struggled with the smoke exposure more than the permanent residents, whose lungs had adapted to the chronic irritation. Foreign guests might spend their entire visit coughing and wiping their eyes while their hosts carried on normal conversations without apparent discomfort. This adaptation process took weeks or months, creating a biological barrier that distinguished longtime residents from newcomers. The morning air was typically clearest, as overnight fires burned lower and accumulated smoke had time to disperse. You'd wake to relatively clear air that gradually thickened as daily activities resumed and fires were rebuilt for cooking and heating. This daily cycle of smoke accumulation and clearance became as predictable as sunrise and sunset, shaping daily routines around atmospheric conditions rather than modern concepts of indoor air quality. When the darkest days of the year rolled in, and the sun decided to take an extended vacation, Vikings turned to an ancient and highly effective survival tool: celebration. You can't freeze to death if you're too busy drinking, singing, and yelling around a bonfire that could probably be seen from neighboring villages. Enter Yule. the midwinter festival that was equal parts religious observance, survival tactic, and excuse to consume everything that wasn't nailed down or still breathing. Yule began around the winter solstice and stretched for days, sometimes weeks, depending on how generous the mead supply was and how desperately the community needed psychological relief from the relentless darkness. This wasn't just a party. It was a psychological life raft designed to carry people through the most dangerous period of the northern winter. When daylight lasted only a few hours and temperatures could kill you in minutes, the human spirit needed something bigger than daily survival to focus on. The preparation for Yule began weeks in advance, as families gathered their best preserved foods, brewed extra ale, and prepared offerings for both gods and ancestors. You'd see the entire community mobilizing like they were preparing for battle, which, in a sense, they were. The battle was against despair, depression, and the very real possibility that spring might never come. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Viking communities planned their entire winter food rationing around the Yule celebration, saving the best provisions for this crucial morale-boosting event. The centerpiece of Yule was the bonfire. Not a modest campfire or a contained hearth flame, but a roaring inferno that challenged the darkness with pure, defiant light. These fires were built from the largest logs available, often requiring teams of people to move the timber into position. The Yule log wasn't just symbolic, it was a massive piece of wood designed to burn for days, representing continuity, warmth, and the promise that light would eventually return to the world. Families gathered around these fires sharing stories, songs, and enough alcohol to make the cold seem like a minor inconvenience rather than a life-threatening condition. The storytelling wasn't casual entertainment, it was cultural preservation disguised as recreation. Sagas about heroes who overcame impossible odds weren't just stories. They were instruction manuals for psychological survival. When your current reality involved months of darkness and cold, hearing about legendary figures who triumphed over adversity provided both entertainment and inspiration. The feasting aspect of Yule represented a calculated risk that demonstrated Viking understanding of psychology and survival. Instead of carefully rationing preserved foods throughout the winter, communities would consume significant portions of their stored provisions during Yule, creating abundance in the midst of scarcity. This wasn't reckless consumption. It was strategic morale management that recognized the importance of hope and celebration in maintaining community cohesion during the darkest months. Historians still argue whether the gift-giving traditions associated with modern Christmas originated during Viking Yule celebrations, but archaeological evidence suggests that exchanging items during midwinter festivals was common throughout Scandinavian culture. These gifts weren't elaborate or expensive. They were practical items like tools, clothing, or preserved foods that demonstrated care and strengthened community bonds during the most challenging time of year. The religious aspects of Yule involved honoring both gods and ancestors, recognizing that survival required assistance from forces beyond human control. Offerings were made to Norse deities associated with winter, death, and rebirth, while ancestor worship acknowledged the accumulated wisdom of previous generations who had survived similar challenges. These rituals weren't just spiritual exercises. They were community-building activities that reinforced shared values and collective identity. Animals were sacrificed during Yule, not just for religious purposes, but for practical nutrition that provided protein and fat when bodies needed maximum calories to maintain warmth. The sacrifice rituals transformed necessary livestock slaughter into sacred acts that honored both the animals and the gods, while providing essential nutrition for the community feast. Every part of the animal was used, from meat and organs to hides and bones, demonstrating the Viking principle that nothing should be wasted during winter survival. The singing and music during Yule served multiple purposes beyond entertainment. Communal singing created shared rhythms and harmonies that built group cohesion while providing physical activity that generated body heat. The songs often told stories of survival, heroism, and eventual triumph over adversity, reinforcing cultural values while providing psychological comfort during the most challenging season. Games and competitions during Yule weren't just fun diversions. They were physical activities that kept bodies moving and spirits engaged during months when outdoor exercise was limited or impossible. Wrestling matches, board games, and riddle contests provided mental and physical stimulation that helped prevent the depression and lethargy that could be as dangerous as physical cold during the long winter months. In Viking Age Scandinavia, gold was nice, silver was better, but wool was life itself, wrapped in itchy, practical fibers that stood between you and a frozen death. You wake up every morning surrounded by wool in various forms: blankets, clothing, wall hangings, and even stuffing in your mattress. Because wool wasn't just a material to Vikings, it was their primary weapon against the cold, second only to fire and the occasional strategic cuddle with livestock. Wool possessed almost magical properties that Vikings understood intuitively, even if they couldn't explain the science behind it. Unlike linen, which clings to you like a cold, wet betrayal when it gets damp, wool retains its insulating properties even when soaked with moisture. This quality made it invaluable in a climate where humidity, snow, and general dampness were constants that could kill you if your clothing failed at the wrong moment. Every household that could manage it raised sheep, not for their charming personalities or entertainment value, but for the miraculous thermal protection growing on their backs. Sheep were walking insulation factories that converted grass, hay, and scraps into renewable warmth that could be harvested annually without killing the animal. You learned to see sheep not as livestock but as partners in a survival contract that benefited both species. The process of turning sheep fur into Viking clothing was a year-round occupation that involved every member of the household. Shearing happened in late spring when the wool was longest and thickest, creating piles of greasy, smelly fiber that would eventually become the difference between survival and hypothermia. The raw wool was washed, combed, and prepared through processes that turned what looked like dirty animal fur into workable textile material. Spinning wool into yarn was primarily women's work, but it was women's work that literally kept families alive. You'd see Viking women with spindles and distaffs constantly in their hands, turning fleece into thread during every spare moment, while cooking, while walking, while supervising children. The spinning process was so fundamental to survival that archaeologists regularly find spindle whorls in Viking graves, suggesting that even in death, women were buried with the tools of their life-saving craft. The quality of your wool clothing announced your social status and survival prospects to anyone who looked. Coarse, roughly woven wool meant you were poor or practical, or both. Fine, tightly woven wool indicated wealth, skill, or access to superior sheep genetics. The truly wealthy could afford imported wool or specially bred sheep that produced finer fibers, creating garments that provided warmth without the skin-abrading qualities of standard Viking wool. Dyeing wool was a luxury that transformed functional clothing into statements of prosperity and artistic achievement. Red dye from madder root, blue from woad, and yellow from various plants could turn basic brown sheep wool into colorful expressions of wealth and creativity. Most Vikings wore natural sheep colors, various shades of brown, gray, and off-white that blended with the winter landscape while providing camouflage during hunting or warfare. Felt represented the extreme evolution of wool technology, fibers that had been soaked, beaten, and abused until they fused into windproof, waterproof mats that could stop arrows or insulate against Arctic conditions. Making felt was like turning wool into medieval armor through a process that involved hot water, soap, and enough physical agitation to convince individual wool fibers to lock together permanently. Vikings used felt for hats, boots, mittens, and even wall insulation. Wool garments were designed for layering, multiple pieces that could be added or removed as conditions changed. Your base layer was a wool tunic that sat against your skin like itchy thermal underwear. Over this went additional tunics, cloaks, and wraps that created air pockets for insulation while allowing flexibility for work and movement. The layering system meant you could adjust your thermal protection throughout the day as activities and weather conditions changed. Maintenance of wool clothing was a constant concern that required knowledge, skill, and precious resources. Washing wool without ruining it involved careful temperature control and specific techniques that prevented shrinkage or felting. Moths and other insects could destroy wool garments, requiring storage methods that protected valuable clothing while maintaining air circulation to prevent mold and mildew. Historians still argue whether Vikings invented specific woolworking techniques or learned them from other cultures, but archaeological evidence shows remarkable sophistication in their textile production. Some Viking woolen garments show evidence of complex weaving patterns and construction techniques that rival anything produced in medieval Europe. The quality of their wool work suggests that textile production was considered a high-skill craft, worthy of significant time and resource investment. Repair and reuse of wool clothing was essential in a culture where nothing could be wasted. Worn areas were patched, damaged sections were rewoven, and garments that became too worn for clothing were repurposed as blankets, wall hangings, or stuffing material. A good wool cloak could last generations if properly maintained, becoming a family heirloom that carried both practical value and emotional significance. It may sound like a contradiction, but some of the coldest weather people in history were also huge fans of getting even colder on purpose. Yes, the Vikings had a passionate relationship with saunas and ice baths, because why merely survive the cold when you can challenge it to a duel and declare victory through voluntary hypothermia? The Viking approach to extreme temperature therapy would make modern spa enthusiasts look like casual weekend warriors. Viking sweat lodges, called badstuffer, were small huts or pits built with stone and turf, where hot stones were doused with water to produce steam that could melt your resolve and your epidermis in equal measure. You'd sit inside these primitive steam chambers, half naked and sweating like a berserker at a summer feast, while the outside world remained frozen solid enough to preserve mammoths. The contrast wasn't just dramatic, it was potentially lethal if managed incorrectly. The construction of these sweat lodges required engineering skills that balanced heat retention with safety considerations. Stones were heated in external fires until they glowed red hot, then carefully transported into the enclosed space using wooden tools that hopefully wouldn't catch fire during the transfer process. The heated stones were arranged in central pits where they could radiate maximum heat while allowing for controlled water application that created the steam essential for the sweating process. Then came the real fun, the part that separated true Vikings from mere mortals who valued their core body temperature. After spending time in the superheated steam chamber, some Vikings would run directly outside and plunge into ice water or roll naked in snow, voluntarily subjecting themselves to temperature changes that could stop a normal person's heart. This wasn't just showing off, though it certainly served that purpose. It was believed to provide health benefits that justified the temporary insanity. These extreme temperature rituals weren't purely about demonstrating Nordic toughness, though they certainly accomplished that goal. The rapid transition from hot to cold was thought to boost circulation, clear sinuses, and provide temporary relief from the constant low-level misery of living in a climate that actively tried to kill you several months per year. Modern science suggests that controlled exposure to temperature extremes can indeed provide health benefits, though Viking methods were probably more extreme than most doctors would recommend. The social aspects of sauna culture created community bonding experiences that strengthened relationships while temporarily melting away the social barriers that normally separated different classes and family groups. When everyone is sitting nearly naked in a steam-filled hut, sweating profusely and trying not to pass out from heat exhaustion, traditional hierarchies tend to become less relevant. Historians still argue whether this democratic aspect of sauna culture influenced broader Viking social structures or simply provided temporary relief from normal social tensions. Sweat lodges also served practical purposes beyond recreation and health benefits. The extreme heat helped cleanse the body of accumulated dirt, smoke residue, and various aromatic byproducts of living in close quarters with extended family and livestock for months at a time. When regular bathing was limited by water availability and indoor heating constraints, periodic steam cleaning became essential for maintaining basic hygiene standards. The ritualistic aspects of sauna use often included spiritual elements that connected physical purification with religious observances. Some archaeological evidence suggests that sweat lodge ceremonies included offerings to gods associated with health, purification, and seasonal transitions. The physical ordeal of extreme heat, followed by cold shock, may have been seen as a form of spiritual testing that demonstrated worthiness to gods who controlled weather, health, and survival. Birthing and healing practices sometimes incorporated sweat lodge environments, where the controlled heat and humidity provided sterile conditions for medical procedures. Women gave birth in heated chambers, where the warmth helped newborns survive their first hours, while steam provided clean air that reduced infection risks. Sick family members were treated in similar environments where the heat was believed to drive out illness and restore health. The tradition of extreme temperature therapy was so ingrained in Viking culture that it survived the transition to Christianity and continued into modern Scandinavian societies. Finnish saunas, Swedish sweat lodges, and Icelandic geothermal baths all trace their origins to Viking practices that combined practical health benefits with cultural traditions that celebrated the human ability to endure and overcome environmental extremes. Some Vikings took the temperature extremes even further, combining sauna sessions with ice swimming, snow rolling, and other activities that pushed the boundaries of human temperature tolerance. These weren't casual recreational activities. They were serious tests of physical and mental endurance that required proper preparation and experienced supervision to avoid permanent injury or death. The equipment used in Viking sauna culture included specialized wooden buckets for water transport, long-handled ladles for steam creation, and birch branches for gentle skin stimulation that improved circulation while adding pleasant herbal aromatics to the steamy environment. These tools were crafted with the same attention to detail and durability that Vikings applied to weapons and navigation equipment. Surviving the cold was one thing, but surviving the boredom, that was its own kind of warfare that required creativity, patience, and occasional bursts of controlled violence directed at wooden game pieces. With long, dark nights stretching like black tar across the winter landscape, frozen ground that made outdoor work impossible, and months of being unable to raid, sail, or plant anything productive, Vikings had to get creative about passing time indoors without losing their minds or murdering their relatives, though the second option probably seemed tempting during particularly long February nights. Winter became prime time for all the maintenance tasks that accumulated during the active seasons when people were too busy with farming, trading, or acquiring other people's property to focus on domestic repairs. You'd spend countless hours sharpening weapons that had grown dull from use, fixing tools that had broken during harvest, restringing bows that had loosened with age, and mending clothes that had developed holes from wear and adventure. If your shirt had a tear in October, you could guarantee it would be expertly patched by candlelight in December, assuming you enjoyed having all your body parts remain unfrozen. The textile work alone could occupy entire families for months. Women, children, and anyone with functioning hands spent endless hours spinning wool into yarn and yarn into fabric that would become next year's survival gear. This wasn't busy work or casual hobby crafting. Every thread spun during winter darkness was another layer of protection against next year's cold. The rhythmic sound of spinning wheels and looms created a constant background soundtrack that mixed with crackling fires and muffled conversations. Wood carving evolved from practical necessity into artistic expression during the long indoor months. Vikings carved everything from simple wooden bowls and spoons to elaborate decorative items that demonstrated skill and provided creative outlets for minds that needed stimulation beyond daily survival tasks. Antler and bone tools were shaped, repaired, and improved, creating implements that would serve the family through another year of challenging northern living. Storytelling became the primary entertainment medium that served multiple purposes beyond simple amusement. The sagas weren't just stories. They were cultural preservation systems disguised as entertainment. These epic oral narratives about gods, heroes, monsters, and family members who made spectacularly poor life choices were passed down through generations by firelight, with each retelling slightly exaggerated for dramatic effect and audience engagement. Thor didn't just kill the giant, he probably punched the moon afterward and made it apologize. Board games provided intellectual stimulation and competitive outlets that channeled aggressive impulses into non-lethal activities. Nephitophel, a strategic game that made chess look like tic-tac-toe, required tactical thinking and planning that kept minds sharp while providing hours of entertainment. Dice games combined luck with skill and probably involved gambling that made winter evenings more interesting, though losing your best wool cloak in a dice game could have serious survival implications. Riddles and wordplay challenges were popular intellectual diversions that tested wit and knowledge while providing social entertainment. These weren't simple brain teasers. They were complex linguistic puzzles that demonstrated education and cleverness while teaching younger family members about language, history, and cultural values. Solving a particularly challenging riddle could earn respect and recognition that lasted well beyond the winter months. Mock duels and wrestling matches provided physical exercise and competitive outlets when cabin fever reached dangerous levels. These weren't serious combat. They were controlled physical activities that allowed people to burn energy, settle minor disputes, and maintain physical fitness during months when outdoor exercise was limited or impossible. Rules and supervision prevented serious injuries while allowing for the release of tensions that built up from living in close quarters. Musical instruments appeared during winter evenings, creating sounds that provided emotional release and cultural connection. Simple drums, bone flutes, and stringed instruments, made from available materials, provided accompaniment for singing and dancing that helped maintain morale during the darkest months. The music wasn't sophisticated by modern standards, but it served essential psychological functions that helped communities survive the isolation and darkness. Alcohol played a significant role in winter entertainment, providing both liquid calories and social lubrication that made long evenings more tolerable. Mead and ale weren't just beverages. They were mood enhancers that transformed potential family conflicts into singing sessions and made storytelling more animated and engaging. The key was moderation. Too little alcohol, and the evening remained dull. Too much, and the evening might end with someone getting thrown into a snowbank. Religious observances and rituals provided structure and meaning to winter days that might otherwise blur together in an endless sequence of cold darkness and waiting for spring. These ceremonies weren't just spiritual exercises, they were community activities that brought people together for shared purposes beyond simple survival, creating social bonds that strengthened the group's ability to endure the challenging months. The Vikings didn't just fight the cold with cloaks, fires, and a questionable relationship with livestock. They fought it with mindset, and not the inspirational poster kind that encourages you to live your best life, but more like a grim, bone-deep refusal to be impressed by nature's attempts to kill them. For the average Norse person, winter wasn't unexpected or tragic. It was simply part of the calendar, like planting season or time to raid France again. They didn't dread winter. They prepared for it, expected it, and met it with the emotional equivalent of a stoic shrug that said, "Oh, it's you again." This psychological resilience wasn't an accident or a genetic quirk. It was a carefully cultivated cultural attitude that trained people from birth to see hardship not as a problem to be solved, but as a proving ground for character development. Cold, pain, hunger, and discomfort weren't failures of planning or signs that something had gone wrong. They were natural conditions that separated the worthy from the weak. You didn't complain about winter any more than you complained about gravity or the need to breathe. It simply was. And your job was to endure it with dignity, and preferably a sarcastic comment about how this was still better than dealing with taxes. Norse mythology reinforced this mental toughness with stories that made winter seem like a mild inconvenience compared to cosmic disasters. When your belief system includes Fimbulwinter, a literal apocalyptic endless freeze that precedes the complete destruction of the world, you stop flinching at a little seasonal snow. The gods themselves struggled against giants, monsters, and forces of chaos that made a few months of cold weather look like a brief, unpleasant interlude rather than a life-threatening crisis. Children learned early that weakness wasn't mocked exactly. It was simply ignored, in ways that were probably more devastating than direct criticism. No one wanted to be the person who couldn't handle the dark months, so people kept going through determination, stubbornness, and a kind of cultural peer pressure that made endurance a matter of social standing. Complaining about cold was like admitting you couldn't perform basic life functions. Technically possible, but socially catastrophic. The community reinforced mental toughness through stories, competitions, and casual conversations that normalized extreme hardship while celebrating those who thrived under challenging conditions. Heroes in Viking sagas weren't praised for having easy lives. They were celebrated for overcoming impossible odds through determination, cleverness, and the ability to keep fighting when any reasonable person would have given up and requested a transfer to somewhere warmer. Physical toughness was developed systematically through childhood experiences that would probably horrify modern parents. Young Vikings were expected to work in cold weather, sleep in uncomfortable conditions, and perform tasks that required them to ignore discomfort while maintaining productivity. This wasn't child abuse. It was survival training that prepared them for adult responsibilities in a climate that didn't accommodate weakness or hesitation. Historians still argue whether this cultural emphasis on toughness created healthier, more resilient people, or simply produced a population with remarkable tolerance for suffering, but the practical results were undeniable. Vikings consistently thrived in conditions that defeated other cultures, expanded into territories that seemed uninhabitable, and maintained complex societies in environments where survival was never guaranteed. The social aspects of mental toughness included humor, specifically the kind of dark, sardonic humor that finds comedy in disaster and transforms potential despair into shared entertainment. When your fingers were numb, your stomach was empty, and your living space smelled like a combination of smoke and livestock, the ability to make jokes about the situation became a survival skill that kept morale functional during the worst conditions. Mental preparation for winter began months in advance, as communities psychologically readied themselves for the coming ordeal through rituals, planning, and gradual acceptance of reduced comfort and increased hardship. This wasn't denial or wishful thinking. It was realistic preparation that acknowledged the difficulties ahead while building confidence in the community's ability to survive and eventually triumph over seasonal challenges. The concept of seasonal depression didn't exist in Viking culture, not because the condition didn't occur, but because the cultural framework interpreted winter melancholy as natural and temporary rather than pathological. Sadness during dark months was expected and accepted, but it was balanced by community support, shared activities, and the absolute certainty that spring would eventually return because it always had before. Work continued during winter at whatever pace conditions allowed, maintaining a sense of purpose and productivity that prevented the complete psychological shutdown that could occur when people had nothing to do except wait for better weather. Even if the work was slower, less efficient, or primarily focused on maintenance and preparation, it provided structure and meaning that helped maintain mental health during the most challenging months. The reward system was built around endurance rather than achievement, recognizing that simply surviving winter was an accomplishment worthy of celebration and respect. Communities acknowledged those who maintained good spirits, helped others, and contributed to group survival during the hardest months, creating social incentives for positive behavior when negative behavior could have catastrophic consequences for everyone. If there's one thing the Vikings understood better than most, it was this fundamental truth. No one survives winter alone. You can have the warmest cloak, the fattest goat, and the sturdiest longhouse in all of Scandinavia, but without community, you're just a well-dressed person with excellent livestock slowly freezing to death in a very nice building. Viking society was built on interdependence, so complete that individual survival was literally impossible. a lesson that modern self-reliance enthusiasts might find both humbling and terrifying. Families didn't live in isolation like modern suburban homeowners who wave politely at neighbors they barely know. They clustered in farms, villages, and settlements that were often made up of extended kin networks and close allies who had sworn mutual aid oaths that were more binding than most modern legal contracts. When winter hit with its usual lack of mercy, this network became your literal lifeline. The difference between making it to spring or becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to go it alone. Food sharing wasn't charity. It was survival insurance that everyone paid into and expected to collect from when circumstances required. If your grain stores ran low, someone else's surplus became your salvation. If your livestock died from disease or predators, the community's remaining animals provided milk, meat, and warmth that kept your family functional until replacement animals could be acquired. This wasn't generosity in the modern sense. It was practical mathematics that recognized individual failure could weaken the entire group's survival prospects. Firewood pooling represented another layer of mutual aid that kept everyone warm through resource sharing and collective labor. Cutting, splitting, and transporting enough wood to survive a Scandinavian winter was more work than any single family could realistically accomplish alone. Community work parties gathered fuel supplies that were distributed according to need and contribution, ensuring that elderly couples and families with young children received adequate heating materials, even if they couldn't provide equivalent labor. Skill sharing created a survival network where individual expertise became collective resources that benefited everyone. The village blacksmith didn't just serve his own family. He repaired tools, weapons, and household items for the entire community in exchange for food, labor, and other services. The master weaver taught textile skills while producing clothing for multiple families. The experienced hunter shared both knowledge and game with those whose talents lay in other directions. Child care was a community responsibility that recognized children as the future of the entire group rather than just individual family concerns. When parents died from disease, accident, or violence, surviving children were absorbed into other families without question or bureaucratic processes. This wasn't adoption in the modern legal sense. It was seamless integration that ensured no child faced winter without adult protection and guidance. Resource storage often involved community granaries, meat cellars, and smokehouses that served multiple families while providing backup supplies when individual storage failed. These shared facilities offered economies of scale that allowed communities to store larger quantities of food more efficiently, while reducing the risk that one family's storage failure could lead to starvation during the critical winter months. Justice and leadership systems ensured that community resources were distributed fairly, while preventing individuals from hoarding essential supplies or shirking collective responsibilities. Local chieftains and Gothi, priest leaders who combined religious and legal authority, were responsible for maintaining both social order and resource distribution that kept everyone alive through winter's challenges. Collective security meant that threats to any community member became threats to the entire group that required coordinated responses. When raiders, wild animals, or natural disasters threatened individual families, the community mobilized as a unit to provide protection, assistance, and recovery support that no single household could manage independently. Peer pressure served as a powerful social control mechanism that encouraged cooperation while discouraging behaviors that could endanger group survival. If you tried to hoard food while neighbors starved, or skipped your share of community work while others carried extra burdens, your reputation would suffer in ways that made future cooperation, and therefore survival, much more difficult. The morning routines of winter communities involved checking on neighbors, sharing information about weather conditions and resource availability, and coordinating daily activities that maximized collective efficiency while ensuring that no one faced the day's challenges alone. These weren't social visits. They were survival protocols disguised as neighborly conversations. Evening gatherings served multiple functions beyond entertainment, creating opportunities for resource sharing, problem-solving discussions, and social bonding that strengthened community ties during the months when those relationships were most critical for survival. Stories, songs, and shared meals weren't just pleasant diversions. They were investments in social capital that paid survival dividends when circumstances became desperate. Historians still argue whether Viking community interdependence created stronger societies or simply reflected the harsh realities of their environment. But archaeological evidence shows remarkable stability in settlements that successfully implemented collective survival strategies, while isolated homesteads rarely survived more than a few generations in the challenging northern climate. At the end of it all, the snow, the darkness, the livestock snoring in your bed, and the constant aroma of smoke mixed with questionable hygiene choices. One truth remained as solid as frozen ground. The Vikings didn't just survive winter, they turned it into a proving ground that forged them into something harder, more resilient, and arguably more effective than civilizations that enjoyed the luxury of mild weather year-round. Every layer of wool, every puff of smoke, every grim joke around the hearth was part of a cultural blueprint designed for one purpose: endurance that went beyond mere survival to become a way of life. Winter wasn't an obstacle to overcome or a problem to solve. It was an opponent that required preparation, strategy, and the kind of stubborn determination that modern people usually reserve for particularly challenging video games. The Vikings trained year-round for this annual match against the elements, building physical and mental resources during the warmer months that would carry them through the testing period when nature tried its absolute hardest to kill them with cold, darkness, and isolation. They adapted constantly, treating every winter as a learning experience that provided information for improving next year's survival strategies. If the Longhouse was too drafty, they patched it with moss, mud, and additional layers of whatever insulating material could be found. If the stew was thin and unsatisfying, they experimented with new preservation techniques and flavor combinations that stretched limited ingredients into more substantial meals. If the nights dragged on endlessly, they developed entertainment and social activities that kept minds engaged and spirits functional during the darkest months. The Vikings didn't have central heating, so they invented human-animal heating partnerships that modern people would find bizarre but undeniably effective. They lacked waterproof gear, so they created it from sheep intestines and stubbornness, producing garments that were functional if not particularly fashionable. They had no antidepressant medications, so they developed sagas, mead, and the kind of dark humor that makes seasonal depression afraid to show up uninvited to the psychological party. While other civilizations slowed down or hibernated during winter months, the Vikings used the season to get stronger, more prepared, and more united as communities. Weapons were repaired and improved during the indoor months. Children received intensive training in survival skills, cultural values, and practical knowledge that would serve them throughout their lives. New ideas were developed around the fire, tested during the harsh months, and refined for implementation when active seasons returned. When the ice finally thawed and spring arrived with its promise of renewed activity, these people didn't stumble blinking into the sunlight like confused cave dwellers emerging from hibernation. They came out ready to plant crops, build ships, make alliances, explore new territories, or sail across oceans to places that were warmer, richer, or simply worth visiting for business purposes that other cultures might consider impolite. Winter didn't weaken them through hardship and deprivation. It hardened them, made them leaner and more focused, and provided intensive training in resource management, community cooperation, and psychological resilience that served them well during the active seasons when they interacted with other cultures who had enjoyed easier winters but perhaps hadn't developed the same level of determination and adaptability. Their success didn't come from magic, divine intervention, or superior technology that made survival effortless. It came from a relentless, often smoky commitment to survival by any means necessary. Whether that meant sleeping under a goat for warmth, steaming in a primitive sauna before rolling in snow, or eating fermented fish that could probably be used as industrial sealant in emergency situations. They did whatever worked, and they did it together as communities that understood the fundamental truth that individual survival was impossible in their challenging environment. The Vikings developed systems, traditions, and attitudes that transformed winter from a season to be endured into a season to be conquered through preparation, cooperation, and the kind of practical creativity that finds solutions in the most unlikely places. Their approach to cold weather survival became a template that influenced Northern European cultures for generations, proving that human adaptability and determination could triumph over environmental conditions that seemed designed to eliminate human habitation. They built something enduring through their winter survival strategies. Not just the ability to live through cold months, but a cultural identity based on resilience, community cooperation, and the confidence that comes from knowing you can handle whatever challenges nature decides to throw at you. This wasn't just seasonal survival, it was the foundation for a civilization that would eventually spread across continents and influence world history in ways that echoed far beyond the snowy fjords where it all began. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a one-room log cabin on the edge of the Kentucky wilderness, a place where survival was never guaranteed and education was considered about as practical as ice skating in July. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a hard-working but uneducated farmer and carpenter who understood dirt, wood, and the kind of back-breaking labor that built character whether you wanted it or not. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was quiet, gentle, and literate, a remarkable combination in a world where reading was often seen as a luxury that interfered with more pressing concerns like not starving or freezing to death. The cabin itself would make modern housing inspectors weep. No windows to speak of, no proper floor except packed earth, and certainly no bookshelves or any other amenities that suggested intellectual pursuits were welcome. Abraham's world for much of his early life consisted of candlelight that flickered with every breeze, silence broken only by the sounds of survival, and endless physical labor that started before dawn and continued until darkness made further work impossible. There was no formal schooling in those early frontier years, a fact that would shape Lincoln's entire approach to learning and self-improvement. He would later estimate that his total formal education amounted to less than a single year. Scattered periods when traveling teachers appeared in the area, and parents could spare their children from essential farm work. But Lincoln had something more powerful and dangerous than formal education: a restless mind and an aching hunger to learn that couldn't be satisfied by the limited intellectual resources of frontier Kentucky. When Nancy Hanks died in 1818, possibly from milk sickness caused by cattle eating poisonous plants, Abraham was only 9 years old and facing a loss that would define his understanding of grief, mortality, and the fragile nature of human happiness. Her death left a void in the boy's emotional landscape that never completely healed. She had been his anchor, the parent who recognized something different and special in him when others saw only a peculiarly tall, awkward child who preferred books to farm tools. After Nancy's burial, which was done by hand in the forest behind their farm with nothing but family labor and determination, young Abraham whittled a wooden marker himself, using whatever tools were available. The marker was rough, crude, and soaked with the tears of a child, trying to process a loss too large for his young mind to fully comprehend. But it represented something important: his first attempt to create something permanent that honored memory and preserved the significance of a life that had mattered deeply to him. A few months after Nancy's death, Thomas Lincoln remarried a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston, and this decision probably saved Abraham's intellectual future. Unlike the stereotypical wicked stepmother of fairy tales, Sarah brought warmth, books, and educational structure to a household that had been struggling with both practical survival and emotional recovery from devastating loss. She recognized Lincoln's unusual intelligence and insatiable curiosity, encouraging his reading habit instead of seeing it as a distraction from more practical concerns. Between farm chores that never seemed to end, Abraham devoured everything he could get his hands on with the desperation of someone who understood that knowledge was his only escape route from a life of subsistence farming. Aesop's fables taught him about human nature through animal stories. Robinson Crusoe showed him that intelligence and determination could overcome impossible circumstances. The Bible provided both spiritual guidance and some of the most beautiful language ever written in English, influencing his later speaking and writing style in ways that would make him one of America's greatest orators. When he couldn't find books to read, which was often in a region where literacy was rare and books were expensive luxuries, Lincoln would write his own thoughts using charcoal on wooden shingles, creating a primitive but effective system for preserving and developing his ideas. This practice of writing down thoughts and observations became a lifelong habit that helped him clarify his thinking and develop the precise, powerful writing style that would later reshape American political discourse. This boy, barefoot and bone-thin, with a face that seemed too serious and thoughtful for his age, was already forging something within himself that couldn't be measured by conventional standards. The world hadn't given him much in terms of material advantages. No money, no social connections, no easy path to success or recognition. But he possessed an internal fire that couldn't be smothered by poverty, isolation, or the countless daily challenges of frontier survival. In that tiny cabin in the Kentucky woods, surrounded by the endless forest and the constant demands of subsistence living, Abraham Lincoln began the long, improbable climb toward greatness that would eventually take him from the humblest possible beginnings to the highest office in the land. As Lincoln grew into his teenage years, life on the frontier didn't soften or become more accommodating. If anything, it hardened and intensified like metal being forged in a blacksmith's fire. His family moved again, this time to the dense, swampy forests of Indiana, where every single day became a battle against elements that seemed determined to break both body and spirit. The work was relentless, clearing massive trees that had stood for centuries, plowing thick clay soil that fought back against every furrow, and surviving brutal winters with little more than a hearth fire, determination, and the kind of hope that refuses to acknowledge how desperate the situation really is. But while Lincoln's body was being molded by the axe, the plow, and the unforgiving demands of frontier agriculture, his mind remained somewhere else entirely. Somewhere larger and more expansive than the physical boundaries of his daily existence. He became known among neighbors not primarily for his impressive physical strength, though he could split rails and lift weights that challenged grown men, but for his towering height and his peculiar habit of reading during every spare moment he could steal from the endless demands of survival. You'd see him carrying books while walking to work sites, his long legs covering ground quickly, while his eyes remained fixed on pages that transported him far beyond the muddy paths and primitive cabins of frontier Indiana. He'd recite Shakespeare from memory while tending fences, his voice carrying across empty fields as he practiced speeches and soliloquies that seemed wildly out of place in a world focused on immediate practical concerns. During brief rest periods, he'd sit under trees with whatever scrap of paper he could find, scribbling thoughts and observations into the margins like someone documenting a completely different world than the one everyone else inhabited. His humor began to develop during these years, a dry, observational wit that was often self-deprecating and always aimed at finding the absurd elements in everyday situations. He was the odd one in most social gatherings, the gangly teenager who could quote Thomas Jefferson, while others traded hunting stories and farming techniques. But when Lincoln did speak in social situations, people found themselves listening almost against their will. His words possessed a clarity and power that cut through casual conversation like a sharp blade through soft wood. Lincoln's social presence was awkward, but somehow magnetic, shy yet talkative, strange but compelling. He didn't fit easily into the established social patterns of frontier life, but he created his own space through intelligence, humor, and an authenticity that made people trust him even when they didn't entirely understand him. His moral compass, even in those early years, pointed steadily toward true north. He demonstrated an instinctive hatred of cruelty, slavery, and the way ignorance was often used to justify both. Despite his complete lack of formal education, Lincoln began developing a passionate interest in law, and legal procedures. The revolutionary idea that words and logic could win battles more effectively than physical force or social position. He taught himself grammar, rhetoric, and argumentation through borrowed books and careful observation of traveling lawyers who occasionally appeared in the area to handle legal disputes that required more expertise than local informal justice could provide. At night, while others might be drinking, gambling, or engaging in the limited recreational activities available on the frontier, Lincoln would be found in dimly lit rooms reading Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England by whatever light he could manage. Candle flames that flickered with every breath of air, creating an atmosphere that was part study session and part religious vigil. He approached legal education with the intensity of someone who understood that knowledge was his only pathway to a different kind of life. By his early 20s, Lincoln had made the decision to leave home permanently, not out of anger or rebellion against his family, but from a growing certainty that his future lay somewhere beyond the limited horizons of subsistence farming. He worked briefly as a flatboatman on the Mississippi River, witnessing firsthand the brutal realities of the slave trade in New Orleans, images that burned themselves into his consciousness and helped shape his later political philosophy about human dignity and freedom. When he returned from his river travels, Lincoln moved to New Salem, Illinois, and began the systematic process of reinventing himself from frontier farm boy to educated professional. He taught himself advanced grammar, joined the local debating society where he could practice public speaking, and through sheer force of will and intellectual determination, began the long march toward becoming a lawyer without the benefit of formal legal education, family connections, or financial resources. This transformation wasn't magic or luck. It was the result of believing that knowledge truly was power, and that personal improvement could be accomplished through effort, vision, and a willingness to endure the discomfort that comes with pushing beyond familiar boundaries into unknown territory. By the time Abraham Lincoln became a practicing lawyer, he was already something of a legend in central Illinois. Not because of prestigious credentials or polished social connections, but because of a presence that commanded attention through honesty, competence, and an authenticity that couldn't be faked or purchased. He wasn't the kind of man who walked into a courtroom and demanded attention through expensive clothes, refined manners, or inherited social status. His trousers were often too short, his coat rarely fit properly, and his appearance suggested someone who had dressed in the dark using clothes borrowed from a scarecrow. But when Abraham Lincoln stood to address a jury, something remarkable happened. People leaned forward, conversations stopped, and the entire atmosphere of the courtroom shifted toward focused attention. He possessed something more valuable than fashion sense or social polish. He had clarity, honesty, and the ability to connect with ordinary people in ways that made them feel understood, rather than lectured to, by someone who considered himself superior to their daily concerns and struggles. Lincoln's path to becoming a lawyer was thoroughly unconventional by any standard measure. He didn't attend law school because no such institution existed within practical reach of his circumstances. Instead, he educated himself through borrowed law books, careful observation of practicing attorneys, and a systematic study program that would have impressed academic scholars if they had been aware of its existence. He passed the bar examination through pure self-study and determination, proving that intellectual achievement was possible without formal institutional credentials. Once admitted to practice, Lincoln took to the 8th Judicial Circuit like someone who had finally found his natural element. A vast network of rural courts that he traveled by horseback, sometimes for weeks at a time, covering territory that would challenge modern lawyers accustomed to air conditioning and reliable transportation. The roads were mud in spring, dust in summer, and ice in winter, but Lincoln loved this nomadic professional life that brought him into contact with people from all economic and social backgrounds. His accommodations during circuit travels ranged from comfortable inns to primitive taverns, log cabins owned by friendly farmers, and sometimes just sleeping under stars when weather permitted and suitable shelter wasn't available. These experiences deepened his understanding of rural life while building relationships with people who would later become important political supporters and lifelong friends who trusted his judgment and character. What truly set Lincoln apart in courtroom practice wasn't just his logical thinking or legal knowledge. It was his remarkable empathy and ability to understand human motivations in ways that allowed him to connect with jurors who might otherwise be suspicious of lawyers and legal proceedings. He could speak plainly without talking down to people, explain complex legal concepts in everyday language, and treat even the poorest farmer or most humble widow with genuine respect and attention. One observer noted that Lincoln had the rare ability to make people feel like he was truly one of them, not someone who had risen above his origins and now looked down on the circumstances he had escaped. This authenticity wasn't a calculated political strategy. It was the natural result of never forgetting where he came from and never pretending to be anything other than what he actually was. A self-made man who understood struggle, limitation, and the dignity that comes from honest work. But Lincoln wasn't soft or sentimental in his legal practice. When a case mattered to him, when he believed deeply in the cause he was defending, he could be absolutely relentless in pursuit of justice. His courtroom speeches might start slowly and awkwardly, but they built momentum like gathering storms, accumulating facts and logic until opposing arguments crumbled under the weight of careful reasoning and moral clarity. His cross-examinations were legendary for their gentle approach that gradually became devastating. He would lull hostile witnesses into comfort and confidence, asking seemingly innocent questions that established patterns of testimony, then suddenly spring a crucial question that shattered their credibility and exposed contradictions they hadn't realized they were creating. These weren't brutal attacks, but surgical procedures that revealed truth through patience and precision. Over time, Lincoln developed a reputation as Honest Abe, not because of clever marketing or political calculation, but because he consistently demonstrated integrity that was remarkable even by the standards of his time. He returned legal fees when he thought clients had been overcharged, refused to represent people who were clearly lying, and walked away from cases that would have been profitable but morally questionable. His growing legal reputation was built on competence, character, and the kind of practical wisdom that comes from understanding both law and human nature. But behind his professional success, another passion was growing stronger: politics, and the belief that legal skills could be applied to larger social problems that required not just individual justice but systemic change. Lincoln's entry into politics wasn't exactly meteoric or accompanied by fanfare. It was more like watching a tall, awkward man carefully test each step before committing his full weight to the political staircase. In 1832, at just 23 years old, he ran for the Illinois state legislature and lost decisively, discovering that good intentions and sincere beliefs weren't automatically sufficient to convince voters who barely knew his name or understood his qualifications for public office. But failure didn't discourage Lincoln or convince him that politics was beyond his capabilities. Instead, it provided valuable education about what he needed to learn, whom he needed to meet, and how political campaigns actually functioned in practice rather than theory. He spent the next 2 years listening more carefully, learning about local issues that mattered to voters, and building relationships with people whose support would be essential for any future political success. When he tried again in 1834, Lincoln won a seat in the state legislature, beginning a political career that would span decades and eventually reshape American history. In Springfield, the new state capital, Lincoln quickly established himself as a thoughtful, principled legislator who didn't make speeches just to hear his own voice or propose legislation designed primarily to advance his personal political interests. He aligned himself with the Whig Party, a political organization that believed in modernization, infrastructure development, and limiting executive power. Principles that appealed to Lincoln's belief that government should serve practical purposes that improve people's lives rather than simply maintaining existing power structures. But even as a partisan Whig, Lincoln remained cautious about personal ambition and suspicious of politicians who seemed to lust after power for its own sake. His speeches in the state legislature were measured, logical, and often infused with the dry humor that made serious political discussions more engaging and memorable. Lincoln didn't try to dominate debates through volume or dramatic gestures. Instead, he built arguments carefully, acknowledged opposing viewpoints honestly, and focused on finding practical solutions rather than scoring rhetorical points against political opponents. During his 4 terms in the Illinois legislature, Lincoln worked on infrastructure projects, educational improvements, and legal reforms that reflected his belief that government could be a positive force for economic development and social progress. He developed alliances with farmers, merchants, lawyers, and other legislators who appreciated his reliability, intelligence, and commitment to keeping campaign promises, even when political circumstances made those promises inconvenient or costly. But throughout his state political career, slavery remained a persistent moral issue that Lincoln couldn't ignore or compromise away, even when taking strong positions might have been politically damaging. Though he wasn't yet calling for immediate abolition, a position that would have been political suicide in Illinois, he consistently opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories and described the institution as fundamentally unjust and incompatible with American principles of equality and human dignity. In 1846, Lincoln made the significant leap from state to national politics by winning election to the U.S. House of Representatives, where he would serve alongside politicians from across the country and engage with issues that affected the entire nation rather than just Illinois voters. His single term in Congress was marked by principled positions that weren't always popular with his constituents, but reflected his genuine beliefs about constitutional government and moral leadership. Lincoln's most controversial congressional position was his opposition to the Mexican-American War, which he criticized as unconstitutional, unnecessary, and motivated more by territorial expansion than legitimate national security concerns. This stance was deeply unpopular in his district, where many voters supported the war and considered Lincoln's opposition unpatriotic or cowardly. The political cost of this principled stand was so severe that Lincoln chose not to seek re-election, returning to Springfield after a single congressional term. Back in Illinois, Lincoln resumed his law practice, married Mary Todd, a well-educated woman from a slave-holding Kentucky family who brought both intellectual companionship and social complications to his life, and attempted to live a quieter existence, focused on professional success and family responsibilities, rather than the demanding uncertainties of political life. But the nation was changing rapidly during the 1850s, and the political compromises that had maintained uneasy peace between free and slave states were breaking down under pressure from westward expansion, economic development, and moral arguments that wouldn't stay quietly contained within existing political frameworks. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery, ignited violent conflicts and deeper divisions that would ultimately make peaceful resolution impossible. For Lincoln, these developments represented a moral crisis that demanded political engagement regardless of personal preferences for private life or professional success. He couldn't remain silent while the nation moved toward accepting slavery as a permanent institution that might expand indefinitely into new territories and possibly even into states where it had previously been prohibited. By the 1850s, the slavery issue had moved far beyond polite political debate into something that resembled a national fever that was consuming rational discourse and threatening the very foundations of American democracy. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which essentially allowed new territories to decide through popular vote whether to permit slavery, had ignited literal warfare in Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers were killing each other with the kind of violence that suggested the entire American experiment might collapse into chaos and bloodshed. For Abraham Lincoln, watching these developments from his law office in Springfield, the moral and political crisis had reached a point where remaining silent would be tantamount to complicity with an institution he believed was fundamentally evil and incompatible with American principles of human equality and dignity. He couldn't stay on the political sidelines while the nation moved toward accepting slavery as a permanent fixture that might expand indefinitely across the continent. Lincoln rejoined active politics not with enthusiasm, but with the grim determination of someone who understood that moral crises sometimes demand personal sacrifice and political risk. He joined the newly formed Republican Party, a coalition of former Whigs, Free Soilers, and abolitionists who were united primarily by their opposition to slavery expansion, even though they disagreed about many other political issues and represented diverse economic and social interests. Lincoln's position on slavery was carefully calibrated to be morally clear while remaining politically viable in a state where immediate abolition would have been electoral suicide. He didn't call for the immediate elimination of slavery where it already existed, a position that would have driven border states into the Confederacy and probably made peaceful resolution impossible. But he argued passionately that slavery could not be allowed to expand into new territories and that the nation could not endure permanently half slave and half free. In 1858, Lincoln was selected as the Republican candidate for U.S. Senate in a campaign against Stephen A. Douglas, one of the most famous and skilled politicians in America, who had been instrumental in crafting the compromises that allowed slavery to spread into new territories. The campaign between these two men became a national spectacle that would define both their careers and help shape the coming crisis that would ultimately tear the country apart. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were unlike anything American politics had seen before. 7 face-to-face confrontations across Illinois, where 2 brilliant orators argued about the fundamental meaning of American democracy, human equality, and the future of slavery, in ways that attracted national attention and helped crystallize the moral and political issues that would soon lead to war. Lincoln's most famous statement from these debates, "A house divided against itself cannot stand," wasn't just political rhetoric, but a careful analysis of the unsustainable tension between American ideals and American reality. He argued that the United States could not continue to exist with 2 fundamentally incompatible economic and social systems, and that the conflict between slavery and freedom would eventually force the nation to choose one or the other. Douglas defended popular sovereignty, the idea that each territory should be allowed to decide the slavery question for itself without federal interference. This position appealed to democratic principles and local autonomy, but Lincoln argued that it ignored the moral dimension of slavery and essentially treated human bondage as just another political issue to be decided by majority vote rather than fundamental principles of human dignity. Although Lincoln lost the Senate race, state legislatures rather than popular vote determined Senate elections in 1858. He won something far more valuable: national recognition as a powerful speaker and principled politician who could articulate the anti-slavery position in ways that appealed to moderate voters who weren't necessarily abolitionists but were troubled by slavery's expansion and its implications for American democracy. The debates were extensively covered by newspapers across the country, and Lincoln's words were reprinted and discussed in parlors, taverns, and political meetings from Maine to California. People who had never heard of the lanky lawyer from Illinois began talking about his speeches and his ideas, creating a foundation of national recognition that would prove crucial in the coming presidential election. Privately, Lincoln continued to wrestle with the enormous moral and practical challenges posed by slavery, writing that, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong," while also recognizing that moving too quickly toward abolition could shatter the fragile Union and possibly make the situation worse for enslaved people, who might face even harsher treatment in an independent Confederacy. The die was cast. Lincoln had established himself as a national figure whose moral clarity and political skill made him a serious contender for higher office, while the country moved inexorably toward a crisis that would test whether democratic institutions could survive fundamental disagreements about human freedom and equality. By 1860, America stood balanced on the edge of a knife blade that had been sharpened by decades of increasingly bitter conflict over slavery, states' rights, and the fundamental question of what kind of nation the United States would become. Sectional tensions had reached a breaking point, where even moderate voices were being drowned out by extremists on both sides who seemed more interested in winning ideological battles than finding practical solutions that could preserve the Union while addressing the moral cancer of human bondage. The Republican National Convention in Chicago was a political battleground where the party's future would be determined not just by ideology, but by calculations about which candidate could actually win the presidency, while holding together a fragile coalition of former Whigs, abolitionists, and moderate anti-slavery voters who agreed on little except their opposition to slavery's expansion into new territories. Abraham Lincoln was not the front runner when the convention began. That distinction belonged to Senator William Seward of New York, a polished statesman with decades of political experience, national recognition, and the kind of credentials that typically determined presidential nominations. But Lincoln possessed advantages that weren't immediately obvious to political observers who focused on conventional measures of electability and political success. His team of supporters campaigned relentlessly behind the scenes, emphasizing Lincoln's humble origins, his reputation for honesty, and his ability to appeal to working-class voters who might be suspicious of more polished politicians who seemed disconnected from the struggles of ordinary Americans. Lincoln was portrayed as the self-made rail splitter who had risen from poverty through hard work and determination. A living embodiment of American opportunity and democratic ideals. The nomination battle required 3 ballots before Lincoln secured the necessary majority, demonstrating both the competitive nature of the Republican field and the careful political maneuvering that brought together delegates who had initially supported other candidates. Lincoln's victory represented a triumph of strategic positioning over pure political celebrity, showing that sometimes the candidate who appears most electable actually is most electable. The general election was unlike anything in American political history. A 4-way race that reflected the deep fractures in national unity that had been building for decades. The Democratic Party had split into northern and southern factions that nominated different candidates with fundamentally incompatible positions on slavery. A 4th candidate represented the Constitutional Union Party, which essentially tried to avoid the slavery issue entirely by appealing to voters who wanted to preserve the Union without addressing the moral and political problems that were tearing it apart. Lincoln's name didn't even appear on ballots in most southern states, where his election was viewed as such an existential threat that many political leaders had already announced their intention to secede if the black Republican candidate won the presidency. This wasn't political posturing or negotiating tactics. It was a serious promise that would be tested within weeks of the election results. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States, with just 40% of the popular vote, but a decisive electoral majority that reflected the way America's political geography had been reshaped by the slavery crisis. His victory wasn't a mandate for radical change. It was more like a narrow escape that barely avoided complete political chaos, while setting the stage for even greater crises that would test whether democratic institutions could survive fundamental disagreements about human freedom. Lincoln didn't celebrate his election victory because there was nothing to celebrate. Within weeks of the election, South Carolina voted to secede from the Union, and 6 more southern states followed before Lincoln even took office. The country was literally falling apart faster than anyone had expected, and the man who would inherit this crisis had no experience as an executive, no national security background, and no clear constitutional authority to prevent states from leaving the Union. As Lincoln prepared to travel from Springfield to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration, he received death threats daily from people who considered his election an act of war against the Southern way of life. Security concerns were so serious that he had to travel secretly through Baltimore, disguised and unannounced, to avoid assassination attempts that intelligence sources considered credible and immediate. The inauguration itself took place under unprecedented security measures, with sharpshooters positioned on rooftops and military units stationed throughout Washington to prevent violence that many observers considered inevitable. This wasn't the triumphant celebration of democratic transition that Americans had come to expect. It was more like a military operation designed to ensure that constitutional government could function despite threats from citizens who no longer accepted the legitimacy of federal authority. When Lincoln finally took the oath of office on March 4, 1861, he faced a nation that was already divided, angry, and armed for conflict that seemed increasingly unavoidable despite everyone's stated preference for peaceful resolution of political differences. Barely a month after Abraham Lincoln took office, the first shots rang out across Charleston Harbor at Fort Sumter, and suddenly the theoretical possibility of civil war became the brutal reality that would consume the next 4 years and test everything Lincoln believed about democracy, leadership, and the price of preserving principles that seemed worth dying for. What followed wasn't just the bloodiest conflict in American history. It was a crucible that would transform Lincoln from an inexperienced prairie lawyer into one of history's most consequential leaders through trials that would have broken lesser men. Lincoln had no military background worth mentioning. His brief service as a captain in the Black Hawk War had involved more mosquito bites than enemy contact, and now he found himself commander-in-chief of a nation at war with itself. He spent countless sleepless nights in the War Department, studying maps with the intensity of someone cramming for final exams, reading military strategy books by lamplight, and trying to understand the mechanics of warfare while making decisions that would determine whether the United States survived as a unified nation. His early presidency was marked by frustration with generals who seemed more interested in avoiding defeat than achieving victory, particularly George McClellan, who possessed the loyalty of his troops, but demonstrated the kind of excessive caution that made Lincoln wonder if the general actually wanted to fight a war or just conduct elaborate military parades. Lincoln's famous observation that, "If General McClellan does not want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a while," captured his growing impatience with military leaders who treated warfare like a chess game rather than a life-or-death struggle for the nation's survival. But Lincoln's real genius wasn't in battlefield tactics. It was in understanding that this war represented something far larger than a dispute about states' rights or constitutional interpretation. This was a fundamental test of whether a nation conceived in liberty could survive when its founding principles collided with economic interests and cultural traditions that depended on human bondage for their continuation. Initially, Lincoln moved cautiously on the slavery issue, believing that aggressive abolition might push the border states into the Confederacy and make victory impossible. But as the war dragged on and casualties mounted into numbers that challenged comprehension, his thinking evolved toward the recognition that slavery wasn't just morally wrong. It was the economic and ideological engine that powered Confederate resistance, and it had to be destroyed if the rebellion was ever going to end. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1, 1863, transformed the conflict from a war to preserve the Union into a war for human freedom, changing everything about how the world viewed the American struggle, while giving enslaved people the legal justification to fight for their own liberation. This wasn't just a military strategy, it was a moral revolution that redefined what America could become if it survived the current crisis. As the war continued, Lincoln carried its enormous weight in ways that aged him visibly and dramatically. Photographs from his presidency show a man growing thinner, grayer, and more lined with each passing year, as if the burden of national suffering was literally consuming his physical being. He read casualty reports that listed thousands of dead and wounded young men, received letters from grieving mothers asking why their sons had to die, and somehow found the strength to continue believing that the cause was worth the terrible price being paid in blood and suffering. The Gettysburg Address, delivered on November 19, 1863, at the dedication of a cemetery for soldiers killed in the war's bloodiest battle, represented Lincoln at his rhetorical peak. 272 words that redefined the purpose of American government and transformed a political conflict into a sacred cause worthy of the ultimate sacrifice. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, became more than political rhetoric. It became a promise that democracy could survive its greatest test and emerge stronger and more just. By the war's end in April 1865, Lincoln had guided the nation through its darkest hour while preserving the Union and ending slavery. Achievements that seemed impossible when he first took office, facing a crisis that many observers thought would destroy the United States permanently. But just as victory seemed complete and the work of reconstruction could begin, an assassin's bullet ended his life at Ford's Theater, making him a martyr to the cause of freedom and unity he had served with such determination and moral clarity. The boy born in a Kentucky log cabin had become the great emancipator, whose legacy would inspire generations of Americans who faced their own struggles for justice, equality, and the fulfillment of democratic promises that had been deferred too long. From splitting rails to splitting a nation in order to rebuild it on foundations of liberty and justice, that was Lincoln's journey. And the fading whisper of his memory still calls across the years, reminding us that leadership sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice in service of principles larger than any individual life. Now the long journey of the Vikings through winter's grip comes to its end, and Lincoln's story fades into the gentle hum of history that rocks us towards sleep. The fires burn low, the voices grow quiet, and the lessons of survival, courage, and endurance settle like warm blankets around our minds. Whether facing the bitter cold of Scandinavian nights or the moral winter of a nation divided, humans have always found ways to persist, to hope, and to build something better from the hardest materials life provides. Rest now, knowing that countless generations before us have weathered their storms and passed down the gift of resilience that flows through your dreams. Sweet journeys through the night, where Vikings feast in warm halls and presidents walk among stars, until morning brings new stories and fresh possibilities for the tales yet to be told.